It was night. It was always night when I was out and about. Granted, you could scarcely tell it was such from the brightness of the city lights. This particular segment of the urban sprawl I called home at the time was full of bright neon, accompanied by a chorus of endless traffic nearby, booming music and drunken shouts of both merriment and outrage. This was where the so-called nightlife could be found. Such things only seemed to get more obnoxious as the decades wore on. I would blame my distaste on aging, but I had not done such a thing in a long time. For all intents and purposes, I have been in my mid-30s for 149 years at the time of writing this journal. That, much like my tendency to only be out at night, is one of the trademark symptoms of vampirism. It is one of the few things humanity has correct about my kind. We do not age. We also burn in direct sunlight. Not immediately. We can withstand it for a while. How long depends on the vampire in question. Eventually, it does lead to a painful and gruesome death. I decided long ago that I would avoid the daylight hours to the greatest extent of my ability. Running water, holy water, garlic, signs forbidding entry, wooden stakes, and crosses, however, are all myths. Stories perpetuated by charlatans, con artists, corrupt religious authority figures, and people desperate to believe they are safe. Frankly, I am unsure as to why anyone ever believed holy water or crosses would work. Why would a Mayan or ancient Greek vampire fear the Christian God? Of course, one thing that humankind can all agree on is that vampires are dangerous, bloodthirsty predators. We are stronger, faster, and very hard to kill. We are possessed of a frenzied and fiendish, insatiable hunger for blood. They have that correct, too. That was why I was there on that rooftop, overlooking the grimy nightclub across the street from me. It was a building full of people with diminished senses, who would walk down back streets and alleyways in the darkness, making themselves easy pickings. Places like that are ideal for all kinds of predators, vampires most deadly among them. My hunger was ravenous. My body ached in an indescribably deep and painful way. Every part of my essence was screaming at me to feed. Par for the course for a vampire who has not drank human blood for a time. It is a suffering unlike anything someone who has not endured it could comprehend. That hunger drives away our sanity like a dog driving sheep. It is a struggle to remain cognizant and not to devolve into mindless beasts. Many of us try to resist at first. In fact, I would wager that most of us resist our hunger for as long as we can, at first. Becoming a vampire does not immediately alter our morals or our natural repulsion at the thought of ending a human life. I starved myself for over a month until the agony became too unbearable. I tried living in the wilderness and surviving on the blood of animals for longer. I found that took the edge off, but it was ultimately not what a vampire needs. In the end, my hunger won. The pain was too unbearable. The screaming in my head was impossible to ignore. I went to the nearest town, walked into a small store, and tore apart the handful of people within. I drained them dry. They were people with friends, families, and histories, and I ended them and stole their futures just to make my own misery stop. It sounds selfish and evil, but the relief was so immediate and so great that I could not even bring myself to feel guilty about it. Ethics cease to be of importance very quickly when your drive to feed is that strong and the consequences for ignoring it so severe. Starve a man long enough and he will eventually eat his neighbor. It was not long until I scarcely thought about my victims at all. I took no joy in what I did, but it was simply how I had to live now. It was just the way of the world. The strange thing is that while vampires do not age, we do learn, we do change. Even if our bodies remain eternally the same as when we returned, our minds can grow. We also have a lot of free time being immortal beings who do not sleep and cannot leave the safety of our homes in the daylight. We watch many films, listen to a vast amount of music, take up many hobbies, and read a great number of books. We do a lot of thinking. Sometimes the media we consume influences that thinking. Sometimes that thinking leads to change. There are a lot of human stories exploring the idea of vampirism, especially since we have long since faded into the realms of fiction and the collective human consciousness. I find these stories intriguing. Often they are quite comical. A lot of the time they make me deeply uncomfortable. There are some things I think I will just never understand. However, fairly often, writers come fairly close to an accurate representation of the vampiric existence. A frequent idea that comes up quite often is the idea of being an ethical vampire. A contact at a blood bank is a frequent trope. However, making such a contact is pretty much an impossibility, and even if it was possible, I think people seem to forget what that blood is being stored for. If we take blood from a blood bank, we are depriving someone in a hospital in need of transfusion of that blood. In theory, we are still responsible for human death in this scenario. Surviving only off of wild animals also comes up somewhat often. As I mentioned, this is actually technically possible, but it only sustains us and takes the edge off our hunger a little. It isn't feasible in the long term, and we will eventually cave and leave behind a scene like I did in that little store all that time ago. Nonetheless, I became fascinated by human vampire stories and the concept of ethical vampirism. Despite the blood on my hands, I am not a bad person after all. I could not help but wonder if such a thing was actually possible. It was not in a vampire story where I found an intriguing idea, though. It was in a series of stories about a more or less normal human being. Depending on the version of the story, the televised adaptation was a touch more grounded. The human being just happened to be a serial killer. An individual with a compulsive need to take human lives. That is not much different to a vampire. The killer had rules, though. He would only murder someone who was themselves a murderer or a sufficiently evil criminal. I could not help but wonder if this honor code could be applied to vampirism, which is what brought me to that rooftop, on that specific neon street across from that specific obnoxious nightclub. I had been following the man for weeks. I had seen him in a bookstore of all places and noticed some behaviors that made me wonder if I had stumbled across a viable target. So I followed him. I stalked him. I learned about his life. I changed from an opportunistic hunter to an active one. I delayed my feeding to the point that the pain was starting to become unbearable to make absolutely certain of his guilt. If I was going to undertake this experiment, I had to do so thoroughly and correctly to be sure it was viable. I admit, despite the pain, there was a strange satisfaction to the task. It was the first time in a long time I had felt purpose like that. Once I was sure, I simply had to wait for the right moment. The moment didn't take long to come. I followed him to the club. I watched and I waited. It was after midnight when he emerged. Inebriated, he stumbled past the fluorescent lights of the street and into a dark alleyway. It was a shortcut to where he had parked his car. I could add the intent to drive drunk to his list of crimes. At that point, I realized that by killing this man, I was quite possibly actually saving more lives given the likelihood he would get into an accident on the road. If accident is even the right word when there is culpability in one's intoxication. I was caught off guard by the little kick of happiness those thoughts provided. He never made it out of the alley. I had been pursuing on the rooftops and jumped down behind him. He tried to wheel around in his shock but tripped over his own tangled feet. I caught him with one hand and slammed him into the wall. It was easy. We really are far stronger than human beings. With slurred speech, he hurled expletives at me. He kicked and struggled. I should have covered his mouth and got it over with quickly, but I was curious about him after everything I had seen. When it became clear he could not overpower me, the fear kicked in. He shouted for help. He begged and he pleaded. I was surprised to find it made me smile. I do not think I had really smiled while on the hunt since World War II. It was hard not to take some joy in hunting Nazis. Honestly, this version of a more ethical vampirism should have occurred to me far sooner given that time period. I asked him if his wife ever begged and pleaded with him like that. I knew she did. I knew his children did too. I asked him anyway, just to see the look on his face. I found I wanted him to know why this was happening to him. I found I wanted to draw it out just a little bit longer. I am not a fool, though. I knew his shouting had likely been heard, so I took that little bit of joy in my task and then sank my fangs into his neck. He kicked and gurgled and went silent. Like a leopard in a tree, I carried his corpse back to the rooftops to finish feeding. I must admit, it was the best meal I had ever had. He was not a killer, but I think he was an evil enough man to count. Of course, no experiment is complete with one test. I will continue to explore this idea of ethical vampirism. I will refine my methodology for finding prey and determine a clearer framework for determining acceptable targets. It might be a little early to say this, but I cannot help but wonder if by the end of developing this honor system, I may end up finding a way for vampires to actually make the world a better place in the long term. It's an interesting thought. It makes me happy to consider it. I have not been truly happy in a long time, so, at the very least, perhaps an ethical approach to our late-night hunts will be good for our psyches. I look forward to seeing what results my next test produces.
Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only talk about things in terms of the writing. Anything like acting, animation, art, etc. is off limits unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I am Daniel Radford, author, immortal philosopher, and also your host. And I am joined once more by John Kernan, the voice behind the reading you just heard of my short story, A Vampire's Treatise on Vampirism.
Hey, uh, blood's pretty cool. We need it.
Wise words. That story is, of course, the focus of the episode today. So, just before we dive into it, fair warning, it is decided to, as we started recording, start raining a little bit, which can be very problematic because sometimes weather happens inside a little bit here. We're gonna do our best. If it gets too heavy, well, you'll never hear this anyway, because we'll have to bail. But if you might get a little bit in the background as long as it stays light. So, that being said, as per usual, I figure I'll start us off a little bit by just sort of going into my thought process going into writing this story, which has an unusually long title for something I've written.
Mhm. Nothing wrong with that. I like a long title every now and then as long as it doesn't sound like a light novel.
I became a vampire and then wrote this long philosophical journey on. No. Uh.
I was bored of being a vampire, so I started this journal.
Right. So, as is often the case, my sort of main goal was just to write something that it was tonally and thematically quite distinct from the other stories we've looked at so far in the cycle. Let the Right One In and Castlevania were both very different and unique takes on vampire stories in their own right. So that made that reasonably easy because neither of them are like trope codifiers. You know what I mean? So it wasn't a difficult job this time, but I still wanted to do something that was definitely distinct from both of those, and that got me sort of thinking. One thing those two stories, despite them being very different, have in common is that neither really delves that deeply into what it's like to actually be a vampire. They touch on it or imply it, especially in the case of Let the Right One In. But neither Castlevania nor Let the Right One In really makes it the central focus of the story. Let the Right One In is primarily about the relationship between Oscar and Ellie. and Castlevania, the base original Castlevania, is more just about the tragedy of the whole situation with Dracula. Nocturne is more straightforward good versus evil. You know, none of them are really focused in on what it is like to be the immortal vampire.
Yeah, the only little bit of that we get is season 3 with Alucard's solo adventure,
Yeah,
which was a part I really liked until the moment where I didn't, and I was made very upset.
it didn't bother me as much as other people. And you know, again, like Let the Right One In has a lot of stuff that's implicit about Ellie's history, but they never go that deep into why being a why their words are hard, why being a vampire is complete shit. You know, it's just sort of left as subtext. That being said, though, I didn't want to do the more common version of this story where the vampire is, you know, the broody anti hero tormented by their thirst and their immortality, because that's been done to death.
And this is a lot more believable. He's still got a sense of morality left. He would rather be doing something good than something bad, obviously, but he has the realistic numbness that you always develop to something you just have to live with for a long period of time. And he's had to live with it a lot longer than humans ever have to live with anything.
Exactly. I thought about that, and I wanted to, you know, touch on the fact that it's not the best existence ever, but also I didn't want to, because I wanted to avoid that, you know, typical like YA broody vampire protag kind of character. That's kind of where this idea of this more philosophical, introspective vampire character came from. Like, there's shades of other archetypes in there, definitely, but he looks at his situation with this sort of strange combination of like a detached pragmatism, a sense of curiosity, and that philosophical streak that seems to just be part of his personality.
Yeah. You know what I've thought of before that I hadn't for a long time until I read a certain part of the story? Wouldn't it
No,
be funny if there was no specific holy or unholy weakness for vampires like crosses, but the reason you see them work a lot is because all vampires have at least an innate amount of pyromancy. Not always something they're aware of, and not always enough to actually control and like create fire, but at least enough to burn themselves. And if they believe in something and believe it's supposed to destroy them, it will.
I mean, yeah, that's a fun idea actually. I quite like that. It's
Therefore,
not something I really did, but
crosses work on Christian vampires. Maybe if the Mayan vampire saw
oh
some
yeah.
sort of trial or holy figure for one of their gods and like, thought they had done some horrible taboo against their belief, and then there was a figure of vengeance coming for them, suddenly they would be really, really weak against it and almost helpless.
Yeah. To be fair, I don't I feel like the Mayans would probably vibe okay with vampires. I mean, I'm pretty sure they have a I think it's the Mayans have a deity that's basically a vampire, and they were pretty big on blood sacrifice anyway, so
Yeah,
or is that more
that's
of an Aztec thing? Inca?
I
I'm not
believe
an I'm not
Mayans
I
did as well, but I can't
yeah.
remember.
I think most of those like sort of South American ancient civilizations still had like dabbled in that sort of area, but
Where's
it's not
Aurochs to
something I know a lot
clarify?
about.
We should have him as a co-host.
For a second there, I thought you were calling him Borox. I was like, "What?"
Oh no. Borox, the vampire cousin of Borat.
Yeah, so I had this idea of this more philosophical but also pragmatic character, a guy who's sort of looking at his vampirism from a sort of broader perspective and wondering, how should I live? How could I live given my circumstances? And one of the things that made me think of is that, well, I mean, vampires and other immortals, but you know, vampires is the topic here. we are dealing with here would have a lot of time on their hands. And that means they have a lot of time to just think and introspect, which would explain perhaps why he's developed this bit of a philosophical introspective streak. But it would also mean that they have quite a lot of time just to consume media, which I am going to be eternally jealous of now that I've thought about it. But that led me to two sort of related but distinct things of what would a vampire get out of reading vampire fiction? But also, how would a vampire be influenced by the media they consume? Because to varying degrees, everyone who consumes stories is going to be influenced in some way by those stories.
Yeah, and I like the idea here that the prevailing both motivation and effect at the same time is curiosity. Like, oh man, a bunch of this is trite. Oh, I know that one's bullshit. I know that one's not true. But hey, well, there's an interesting idea here that I wonder if I could make that work.
Yeah, exactly. So we end up with this character who is both explored fiction about his sort of demographic, his people, what he is, and has that's led to him having thoughts about being a vampire that he didn't would necessarily have had, or it's given him room to think about how society perceives vampires, which likely I think contributed a bit to him wondering about ethical vampirism. Also occasionally repulsed him.
Of course, as it
Uh,
does many of us.
but because that same curiosity, that same like wondering about the ethics of vampire, then led to him making this connection because he basically watched a few seasons of Dexter and realized there was nothing stopping him from actually doing that.
Yeah, he's like, I already have to hide in the shadows and kill people just to like live.
Yeah, he sort of started to question, I could actually do this, and in doing so, be a very different kind of vampire than the creature that exists in mortal fiction. I could do this, and it would be inherently perhaps more ethical, but could that mean positive things for the world and for myself?
Yeah, like I may have I may have stopped really feeling guilt at what I have to do to survive, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot of satisfaction to the idea of eliminating that inherent guilt that's there on a base level. Like yeah, you may not feel guilty about it. That doesn't mean you feel good about it. What if you could find a way to feel good about what you're doing to survive?
Because, like, that's the thing, is that he is still a person, even if he's not necessarily a human anymore. And for most people, there is some sort of inherent thing in us that makes us look at killing another human being and feel discomfort. And something that has always struck me as interesting and a bit strange is that a lot of media, the minute someone becomes a vampire or similar, they suddenly lose that and become more vicious, more bloodthirsty. They get into it, they enjoy it. And I was like, but it it's still the same person. I could see a person developing into that over time, depending on who they were as an individual. But this is just a normal guy. I don't see why he would suddenly be like, yeah, fuck yeah, let's murder some humans.
Yeah, even if you look at it from the more physical aspect, like for instance, the angle of addiction, perhaps, it's still like that only explains, sure, that could explain the physical euphoria, even like the rush of chemicals that might make you feel good emotions in the moment. but like people who have crippling drug addictions don't just change their morals and start thinking that those drugs are an objectively good thing that are great anyways, no matter how much they might enjoy the physical feelings they get from it or justify to themselves their habit. That doesn't mean they start to think it's a good thing and absolutely revel in the very like existence of it. And it stands to reason that a similar thing would apply to vampires. Yeah, like nothing's going to change the physical rush, the absolute like inebriation of good chemicals that their body forces on them when they satisfy the hunger. But that doesn't also like overwrite their moral character or their beliefs.
Yeah, my thought was like a person who is evil or inclined to do bad things in some way is probably going to, if they become a vampire, be an evil vampire or inclined to do bad things in some way. But a good person who becomes a vampire is not going to suddenly become evil just because they become a being who, by their nature, has to be more predatory. What you're going to get perhaps is over time desensitized or depressed, depending on how virtuous you are. And one may even lead to the other. It may even just be cyclical,
Yeah,
and that's kind of where this guy is with his morality. Where for most of like he talks about it in the story in his quotation marks journal, where yeah, at first he tried to resist. He recoiled from the idea. He was like, "No, I'm not going to murder people. Fuck that. I'm a decent person."
that sucks. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, like that repulses me. And for a while, like I don't want to just bite into things next and drink their blood. After about a month of increasingly incredible agony and suffering, he was like, okay, well, okay, what if I just try animals?" And that, that took the edge off a bit. It let him subsist for a while longer, exist for a while longer. But eventually, the, his nature won out, and he tore apart a shop full of people, drained them all. Just and in the instant he did that, the relief was so sudden and so intense that he couldn't even feel guilty because because it was no longer pain, no longer suffering. He was okay again, and he talks about it in the story. He sort of says, in his very flowery way, that if you starve a man long enough, he'll eat his neighbor. You know,
Yeah,
if you hear, I don't know if it's true if it or not, but you hear that story of people who crashed into a mountain and eventually started eating each other because there was no food.
yeah, it's just about impossible to begin with for any person to just consciously not eat forever, especially if they are capable of it. And vampires have that hunger at least like 2 or 3 times as intense as as humans. So what they are going through by the time they get to the point where their life could possibly endanger for the hunger is so like incredibly intense. It's the equivalent of like if a human was stranded somewhere with no food at all, but seeing things they could eat off in the distance for a long period of time, except you just don't starve. You just continue to get hungrier and hungrier and hungrier without dying when you should.
That combination of immediate relief from his own suffering and the realization that this is basically going to go on forever, that he doesn't have a choice, made him very pragmatic. He decided, look, I don't like this, but, you know, a predator in the wild doesn't feel guilty when they eat their prey to survive. I can't either.
Yeah.
I'm not going to revel in it, I'm not going to become one of those horrible monsters from the stories, but this is just how it is. This is my life now. And he just sort of accepted that and got set in that way, and for a long time that is just how he has existed until but having all that time on his hands and reading all this vampire fiction, watching a couple seasons of Dexter, uh, he's suddenly had this idea of, well, like, hang on, what if I was a picky eater, basically? What if I specifically chose to target people who maybe deserve to die a little bit in my eyes?
Yeah.
Does is that more ethical than just preying on whoever is nearby? Because and it's like it's not like he's never explored alternatives. He talks about the blood bank trope, where the good vampire just visits a blood bank, and we touched upon this in I think it was the first episode in the cycle, where realistically speaking, yeah, you're not actively killing somebody, but that is still blood that was going to probably save a life. So you're still
Yeah.
taking that from someone who needs it to survive.
Can you really say you're not hurting people if you're stealing life-saving things that are in limited supply that people have to give willingly to save other people?
Yeah. So that contributed to it. It's not like he'd never explored alternatives, but this is the first time in a while that he's had a thought, had something click, and gone, "Oh, yeah. No, there is an alternative, sort of, and that's just to be more targeted." And he sort of jokes to himself. He was alive during World War II. He thoroughly enjoyed hunting Nazis. That he really should have had this thought a long time ago. But he is still a person, and people make silly mistakes or miss obvious things, especially when they have resigned themselves to their fate already.
Yeah, because even though he was enjoying it at the time, he wasn't thinking about the moral or ethical implications of what he was doing. Really, he just had that slight reticence to kill gone.
Yeah. Exactly. It was just a matter of acceptance. And sometimes when you accept things as they are, you forget that you have the agency to make changes. And then something will remind you that you in fact are a being with agency and you can make choices. And it is up to you whether those choices are a positive or a negative for you and for others. And that all those thoughts have been going through his head for a little while at least, and thinking back on his history, not eating Nazis, he's sort of gone, I enjoyed that. That was good for me because I knew they were evil people in theory. To clarify, this is not me saying, oh, Nazis, maybe they weren't so bad. No, the Nazis were evil, but not every German soldier was a Nazi.
And not every member of the Nazi party actually believed in what they were doing.
Yeah,
There were many
just
people who joined the party simply because, I mean, what are you going to do? Be a pariah, be poor, be broke, and possibly constantly be a target for being branded as a traitor?
yeah, just putting an asterisk in there. Yeah, he probably also still killed some good people during that time.
But it was a lot easier for him to just expect most of the people he was killing were bad.
Yeah, and building on that history, building what he's realized now, he's come to this conclusion, right? Of, well, maybe ethical vampirism is possible. And being the person he is, the sort of curious individual, he's decided to run this experiment and start depriving himself of food longer. He is suffering, increasing the length of his suffering, but in doing so is selecting what are, in his mind, at the very least, acceptable targets who the world may be better off without. And he is now posing the question, in all the stories I see, vampires are a blight upon the world. In every mythology, we are a thing to be feared. We are a problem. We are a plague. Could we, in theory, if we operate in with a code in a rule set, actually be a net positive for society by removing its negative elements?
What if instead of a vampire bat, I could be a vampire Batman?
Honestly, a little bit, yeah.
Du-du-du-du.
That wasn't that the X-Men theme?
No, that's a little similar.
It is kind of similar, yeah. Now you mention it, but yeah. So that is interesting to me, right? This idea of, does that justify his existence? Does it justify what he's doing? Because morally, it's complicated. And I'm a sucker for some moral complexity in a story, because he's still murdering people. He is still now appointing himself judge, jury, and executioner.
And it's very likely that at least a few of those people he is killing that he believes deserves it, we wouldn't necessarily believe deserve to just die and be like the victims of serial killer in a dark alley.
It goes back to a lot of the stuff we talked about in the superhero cycle, right? It is actually thematically very similar now that I think about it. It's this idea of, this individual can do this because he has the power to do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean he is morally correct, that he is not going to make mistakes, and that it is okay that he is doing these things. But
Yeah,
there is the added twist, that sort of added element of, he has to eat somebody.
yeah. We can, uh, unlike in our case of a certain Mr. Vigilante, quote unquote superhero, we can appreciate that Mr. Vampire here is at least trying to do the very best he can because he is actively attempting to hurt less people less
Most people what?
because his well what I mean is like you kill a good person, you're usually hurting a lot more also people and causing a lot more ultimate pain than just the person whose life you're snuffing out.
Yeah.
But either way, I mean, he is making a compromise and that his only two options are literally continue to take life from others or die. So he is trying to find the least hurtful, least painful, like most moral way he can at least divine to continue existing and continue living without turning into a ravenous psychotic monster.
Yeah, and again, I mean, in his, the question he is asking, that he is posing, the like crux of his theory is that perhaps in doing, like, perhaps my existence and the existence of my kind can actually serve a purpose for humanity, and ultimately create a net positive by removing all these problematic, dangerous, immoral people.
Yeah, perhaps
Which,
we can feel at least decent about living our lives and not either completely give in to the psychosis or feel like we're monsters.
yeah, I see, it's important that you mentioned that last part, because something that I tried to make clear in the story is that this isn't like the vampire saint. He is not, his motivation is not entirely selfless here. He went on for a lot longer than theoretically he needed to before he came to this conclusion, and during that time, he was killing people without remorse or guilt, and he wasn't delaying how often he did it. So there is that to consider. There's also his personal motivations, right? he openly says, even if this isn't actively better for society, the the belief that it is, the feeling that it is that we are making a positive difference could be better for us as individuals.
I feel better killing people I deserved. I am confident deserve to die.
Exactly. So at the very least, it's better for me. And there is an element of just detached curiosity, right? This idea of he just kind of wants to see if it's true that operating under this framework he's developing for to be an ethical vampire will have that result. Part of it is just genuine curiosity. And that kind of makes sense because he's an immortal being. He's not a human. He is a person, but he is not a human. So he's going to have a very different view of the world compared to a human being. He's going to have grown to have a very different understanding of the value of a human life compared to the experience of a normal human.
Exactly. Vampires may never stop being people, but once they've been vampires long enough, they certainly stop being human. You could argue they stop being human right away, but I would really say like the earliest parts of being a vampire are probably more like being a human with a curse or an affliction, because it doesn't just instantly change who you are. But once you've lived your life long enough that you've spent way more time being a vampire than being a human, you effectively aren't human at all anymore. You can still be a person, have feelings and emotions, but you might as well have never been human to begin with at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Because for one thing, humans are food to a vampire. And, you may not want the food to suffer unnecessarily. I mean, we as human beings, slaughter cattle, slaughter pigs, and consume them for their meat. But generally speaking, we don't want them to suffer and have a painful experience in death. We want them to live a generally speaking, those of us who aren't assholes want them to live a fairly comfortable existence and have a quick and painless death.
And definitely not a reference or a plug here. We have strong evidence that the better the life they live, the better they are as food, too.
Yeah. And Uh, and on top of that, you've also got just the natural thing of as an immortal, he looks at the human lifespan now in very different terms. A human life to him seems so much shorter and less impactful now than it did to him as a human being. And like in vampire terms, he's not that old a vampire. So
It's
he
probably
hasn't
like, what,
quite.
160?
I think I said he was like 140 or something.
Oh, I thought
So
that might just be how long he's been a vampire. My bad.
true. That's a good point. I don't know. Like he might actually be a little bit older, but yeah, he's not super old by vampire terms. He's had like an extra lifetime roughly of existence compared to a human. He's not reached the point yet where he looks at human life as insignificant in the grand scheme of things
But
compared
on
to
top
his
of
own.
being old, he has also snuffed out many lives much shorter than his own, and that
Yes,
does
and
it too.
yeah, and that definitely contributes. Just again, we're food to them. And he's at a place where he's not like completely detached from humanity yet, but is in the process of becoming more detached. And his morality kind of reflects that. He's not looking at things in terms of the morality of his individual killings at this point. He is looking at things with a much broader view of the of reality. This
Which
idea of
ironically is giving
net
us
good.
it's ironically giving him a much more human view of things than you actually normally expect from a vampire. Because there's never that thought of, well, maybe I should just stop eating. It's, well, what's the best way for me to continue eating?
Yeah, it's a lot like, realizing that factory farming is bad, so supporting free range.
Yeah, you're not just gonna go, "Oh, man, humans do bad things to animals. Oh, man, humans do bad things to plants too? I guess I can't eat.
Yeah,
Guess I'll die."
guess I'll just die. It it is very much in that vein. So it's funny, like in some ways he's so much more human than a lot of other vampire characters, but in other ways he's so detached that you can't possibly look at him the same way as an ordinary person. And I'm really pleased with that. I'm not gonna lie. Like I'm wasn't that enthusiastic going into this about having to write a vampire story. Yeah, I've enjoyed a lot of vampire stories. Let the Right One In is an amazing movie. The Castlevania series is incredible. I really enjoyed the Underworld movies. Dracula's a classic for a reason. All these things.
Yeah, there's a ton of good vampire media out there, but there's also, in general, so much.
Yeah, and I was like, do I really want to contribute to this oversaturated area of storytelling? And I was like, well, I kind of have to now because we decided to do the cycle on vampires. And it's not like it's the first time I've tackled an area of storytelling that has been done to death because we did superheroes too. So it became more about, okay, well, how can I, rather than make this a vampire story, how can I make this my kind of vampire story? What can I do that's going to have more of my thoughts and feelings and ideas behind it, you know?
I'd say you did really good. It's more dense than a lot of the other short stories, also. It doesn't look like it's that much longer purely in volume, and yet it took me longer to read it.
Oh yeah, well you see, there is a reason for that. Uh, which I'll get into in a second. But yeah, I don't want to. I was gonna say I didn't want to like toot my own horn too much or anything like that. But I ended up actually being really proud of this one. I'm fascinated by this character I've conjured up, but I don't know if I necessarily want to explore his life more because I think there is. And this is also something else we could touch upon a bit. I think there is actually more impact in leaving the results of his experiment more open ended. But I feel good about this one. Some of these stories at the end of them, I'm like, okay, it's good enough. Uh, Others, on one occasion, I end up just fucking despising the story, and I didn't even put the written version up on the site. That was I can't remember what I called it now. It's one with the astronauts. Smiling into the dark. I loved the concept, wasn't happy with the execution at all, hated it. This one, I'm like, no, this is good. I like this one. Um,
I like to imagine that at least one of the other vampires, I made the joke already, but I like to imagine that at least one of the other vampires who ends up hearing about his experiment and his little crusade actually decides to try to be a vampire hero and like
yeah,
add a little bit of showmanship to only taking down and only killing quote unquote bad guys, and it just ends up going horribly wrong because they're being a naive idiot.
get another one who just becomes Blade hunting around the vampires that don't follow the rules.
Yeah, and you get all these different things going on. That honestly, that's actually one of the strongest ways I could see almost like a really influential vampire coven almost gathering around this fact is a mixture of vampires who see the the benefits of the idea, but also ones who are looking at the results of the ones who take the wrong lessons from it and go do stupid shit and be like, okay, we have to put a lid on this.
Yeah, I wouldn't call this an origin story, but it is definitely easy to look at this and see how it could be the like history for how a proper underground vampire society or like vampire heroes or whatever got started, which wasn't the intention, but it's cool that we ended up there.
Absolutely.
But to go into what you said, how this one, despite not being that much longer, it's about the same length, I think, as Five Lessons, more or less. Uh, the reason it feels more dense, I think, is because I wrote it very specifically because I wanted it to reflect his age and his sort of poetic philosophical streak. So he often is a very, well, not very, but he's often a bit flowery. He uses a lot of allegorical language. He doesn't shorten things down or really use contractions and things like that because I wanted to communicate both that he's originally from an era where that wasn't how we talked, and also that he is a bit of a philosopher, a bit of an armchair philosopher, I guess, a little bit of a poetic streak to him, but introspective, and choosing to use that a lot of allegorical language and longer, more flowery language was a way to communicate that, and that probably contributed as well. But so did the fact that he has that somewhat detachedness to him, right? And I wanted to show that as well, and I found one of the best ways to do that was to make him, despite how verbose he is, somewhat conversational in his writing. So he rambles a little. He takes this kind of winding path to get to his point, and he has this kind of conversational, casual vibe in a way, even though he uses this sort of flowery language, doesn't contract things or whatever. But yeah, he
I
kind of has
greatly
that
enjoyed
vibe
that.
despite the brutality of what he's talking about and despite of the existence he leaves and the fact he's talking about weighing up the value of individual lives. And I feel like the way he talks or writes, I guess, says a lot about his character. And that's probably the
Yeah.
end result of that was that it took a bit longer and felt longer to read.
I was glad to see it, honestly. I don't remember if I've specifically said this on a podcast before, but I've ranted to it a little bit about a bunch of different people over the past couple of years. I think flowery language is actually very underrated. It's kind of fit into this little niche of having very strong cliche vibes and making a lot of people cringe. And I think the problem we ran into kind of there is a little similar to the problem with vampire stories, in that it's not a genre, so you don't think about it. I think flowery language is oversaturated. I think it's in a lot of things, and you see it so much, people see it and are impressed by it and want to do it themselves without really understanding how to do it. It's one thing I think not many people know about flowery language is it's it's totally got the capacity to be just as amazing as anything else without being pretentious and up its own butt, but it's hard. Flowery language is a lot harder to write than people realize it is, which results in there being a ton of it out there that's just bad. But it's not because flowery language is cringe, it's because you're reading a
Yeah,
bunch of it that's
I mean, I
bad.
think the thing with like flowery language and things like that is that you don't want to slip into the point where it becomes what some people call purple prose. This just yeah, it's
Oh,
that sort of
that's a good phrasing. I like that.
overly done, overly dramatic, super flowery language that says nothing and ultimately detracts from the story.
Trying to sound like you're a
Kinda, yeah.
character in
It's like
Shakespeare.
this idea of going so hard on the flowery language that ultimately the what you're trying to communicate gets lost. And that is something that irks me personally as a writer. And not just in prose, right?
Yeah,
Like it's not just like
it really is pretentious. A lot of people who write it think it's good just by being what it is, and so they use
yeah,
it.
like as a storyteller, I generally prefer more direct language. Like you've read my other stories many times at this point. Even before we started doing this podcast, you've read a lot of my writing, and I generally tend to be a pretty
Yeah,
straightforward storyteller because it's important to me that what I'm saying comes across correctly and that it is accessible to as many people as possible. And I don't want unnecessarily flowery language to get in the way of that. I mean, even with poetry, I have a similar stance to that, right? Where I think that there comes a point where there's a little too much flair to a poem where when the meaning of it is no longer decipherable because you've gone way too all in on being fancy and poetic, then I think you've created something that kind of misses the point. Because yeah, sometimes interpretation, especially with poetry, is a big part of it, and it can be a part of it with prose too. But you had something you wanted to say, so if that's getting lost, you've kind of failed your objective.
Yeah, the how of like how you tell or how you say what you want to say is important, but it always is ultimately secondary to actually saying it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just kind of my thoughts on that. So I'm glad that with this story, despite it being a lot more like flowery than my writing usually is, it came across the way I wanted it to, because I didn't want it to go so deep into that sort of thing that it just became a vampire on a rooftop just spouting bullshit.
You did it well. It helps that the vampire himself is the same way because he speaks during some of the parts where he's directly there are parts where he's narrating and there are parts where he is talking in through the journal essentially. And I think it helps that really it's only the parts where he is quote unquote talking, so to speak, that he's actually flowery. And it's very clear, like otherwise, that his thought process, who he is, what he actually does, isn't flowery. It's just a way that he communicates and a way that he
Yeah,
interprets. And that makes it come through a lot clearer because you're not going through that the whole time. That's just how
yeah,
his voice
he's a
comes to
lot
you,
more
more or less.
God, we need another word other than flowery. We've said the word flowery so many times.
Oh man, but flowers are so flowery.
But yeah, he is a lot more, I guess, poetic and verbose when he's describing his own thoughts and feelings compared to actions that are occurring. Because I think that is how an actual person, even one who did have that kind of streak to them, I think that is how they would write. That's how they would talk. They when it we talk about even people who don't have that streak, people like me, even who are very blunt, we tend to use allegory and poetics a lot more to talk about thoughts and feelings and ideas compared to just actions. So I wanted to try and stick to that kind of framework.
Yeah. It's I think you handled it well. It really keeps it from becoming overwhelming or seeming like it's there for its own sake. Because I got a little verbose myself in describing my feeling on it earlier, but I think the biggest and most common problem with that type of language is people doing it for its own sake and not because they think it's a good way to
Yeah,
communicate what they're trying to say. They just think it is inherently good, therefore I
yeah. I
do it and
mean,
it makes my
you know,
writing better.
old books kind of get a pass to an extent because people talked more like that back then,
They
and
were just talking
that
normally
it
for
doesn't
the
come
time.
across as disingenuous when you're reading a book from like the 1800s or something, uh, compared to like if someone in 2020 is like, well, I'm writing a fantasy novel, so everyone's going to talk like this.
Yeah. You know why reading Shakespeare works? Because it's Shakespeare.
Well,
That is how he
he
talked.
probably didn't talk in iambic.
I don't know, man.
In
He
fact,
was weird.
I suspect Shakespeare probably actually spoke quite lowbrow given the nature of the humor in most of his stories,
Yeah,
but he
no,
wrote like
you're
that.
right. But he made the style. It was how he wanted to communicate in his stories. So it works. It's completely genuine and heartfelt. And because we have some evidence to see here and there, especially by him apparently coining the word fuck, that he was perfectly capable of speaking normally, down to earth, and lowbrow, which is a big part of why just how into it and how thoughtful, wordy, verbose, whatever you want to call it, his writing works, because that's not all there is. That's not all he is.
It does kind of work in universe as well, right? I mean, this wasn't something I did out of intent, full disclosure. This is just something I'm realizing now. But it does work in universe to an extent that he had this flowery language, but it was still easy to understand, right? What he was getting across. And that makes sense because it's at least semi-apparent, I think. I didn't even say anything explicitly, I left it implicit. But clearly the point of this journal is that someone is supposed to read it. It is specifically a vampire's treatise on vampirism.
Yeah, he's writing it as if it is the beginning of his collegiate
Exactly.
thesis.
No wonder it was unnecessarily flowery. But yeah, like the point.
That's a Dr.
He's gonna get
Vampire.
his
Thank you.
PhD in philosophy with this. But I mean, maybe he's already going. He's been around for a while. He's probably knocked off a couple degrees just to kill time.
Now it's time for his doctorate
Well,
on
that is something
vampirism.
different. Vampire sciences.
I am no longer just a vampire doctor. I am the Dr. Vampire.
But yeah, the whole this is clearly like he wants people to read this as part of the process, as part of explaining his rationale behind the philosophy and the framework he is developing, as well as to give, albeit anecdotal, but evidence to support what he is saying. The point of this is to rationalize the framework he's developing and to eventually show this and make it somehow available to other vampires. Maybe he'll release it as fiction, assuming that other vampires also read vampire fiction for a laugh, and that they'll just go, "Huh, interesting." But you touched on something earlier. You talked about, despite the flowery language, wanting to get genuine thoughts, feelings, and ideas across, and that feels like a sort of good segue to get to something else I mentioned earlier that I want to touch on, which is that at no point does this story answer his question.
Nope.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is just because, like, in universe, diegetically, like, he's not reached a conclusion yet. He's still figuring it out. He's clearly leaning one way, I think, by the end of it. But yeah, in universe, it's the midpoint. But out of universe, from how do I say it? The Doyleist perspective, from where I was sitting, I didn't want to answer the question. I wanted to leave it somewhat open because I wanted to pose the question to the reader. I wanted them to sort of think on, in his position, is his framework for vampirism in fact ethical? Does him following this code, should it exist, come to pass, whatever, does that make this predatory existence of his okay? Does it justify his past killings if in the long term he creates a net good for humanity, if that is indeed what happens? Is it okay that he is putting himself in this position to make decisions about who is good enough to survive and who isn't? I didn't want to give an answer to that question. I wanted people to have to think about it. But I wanted it to be clear that those were the questions we were asking. And that was a really weird way of pronouncing those.
It works.
But yeah, you talked about what it, like, these sort of the genuine like ideas present and things like that, and that was something that I wanted to come back around to, because that is at the heart of the story. That is the question he is asking himself, and it's the question I am asking the readers, because hypotheticals and moral quandaries and moral philosophies and things like that I find fascinating and very interesting to explore, even if it is answering a question that has never and will never exist to that capacity in reality. You can draw parallels, like, is it okay to kill a killer if it means they will then not harm more innocents? Is it okay? Things like that. You can draw those parallels, and if the story makes you think of things like that or otherwise, that's great. I'm happy with that. But I personally prefer it when stories have something to say, when they're not just purely there for it. I mean, it is there for entertainment. That's the primary purpose, right? But I always prefer a story that makes you think because I find that that's more engaging, and that's what I wanted to put out into the world when I wrote this and when I write anything.
Yeah, all the best media at the very least posits us a question or two. Or even if it doesn't directly ask a question, it gives us things to think about. There are some things can be entirely great purely on their entertainment value, but even vast majority of things that seem that way still have questions to ask and things to think about. It's important.
Yeah. I mean, at the heart of it, pretty much any story could be summed up by asking what if dot 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 dot. And
Yeah.
I admit it's not always easy to do to when I'm effectively mass producing short stories for this podcast, right? It's not always easy to do that, to pull off the, you know, writing in a way that is engaging to me in the way I want it to be engaging and what I hope is to the audience. So I'm again pleased with how this one turned out. Uh, but again, that's enough gloating on my part. Instead, we'll turn the floor to you real quick and sort of ask, as I often, I try to always do it with these episodes, and sort of, is there any particular thoughts you have about the story that we've missed? Anything you would criticize or change, or just anything that you want to point out?
Mm, not much. I might say that it could have used wouldn't want it to be too long, although it could have used maybe a little bit more of him, like, thinking to himself or writing down, like, maybe one or two more of the reasons he thought the guy was bad beyond just the implication that he might be. He's a bit of an abusive
Okay.
father, at least. But that's only because, like, that was the only time while I was reading where I thought to myself, like, "Wait, yeah, how bad actually is he? What
Okay.
has
See,
he done?"
that's interesting because now that you say that, I think you might be right, and that because in universe the whole purpose of this was to start developing a framework, he probably should have espoused upon that more. At the time of writing it, I chose not to go into the process of him stalking the guy and finding out what he actually did and things like that because I wanted to emphasize that the question at the heart of it of, is it okay that he's putting himself in this position and things like that? Because I wanted to highlight that he is making this decision. Uh, it's based entirely on his morality, and I thought that by putting more actual presence and more focus on what the guy did into the story, I would possibly harm that. But like now that you've mentioned it to me, I think I do agree that because of the nature and universe of what the like journal is for, it makes more sense that he should have probably written about it in more detail.
I still agree with your thoughts behind the decision. I don't think it needs much more detail, even necessarily. Just listing of at least like a couple more of the things the guy has done or the reasons why he's decided to pick him as a target and thinks he deserves it. Since
Y-
this is this first
Yeah,
part of his experiment, he would
it
want
didn't
to
need to like I
document
didn't need to like
his
dedicate like
reasons.
multiple paragraphs to describing the hunt because that's not the point. But it would have done it. It would have been a service to the like narrative and the in-universe purpose of the journal for him to actually list the guy's crimes in text.
I think the
Yeah.
audience deserves to know. I think the audience deserves to know about that that man ripping a balloon out of a character's hand
Yeah,
or a
exactly.
kid's hand yesterday and letting it float away. That wasn't cool.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism.
That's kind of really about it. Everything else like I either straight up liked or was directly on the same page as
I
you
mean
while I was
that's
reading it.
always fun when that happens. 'Cause I mean, you guys don't necessarily get to see all of this, but sometimes we'll come out of these episodes, not even just the stories I've written, but we'll be like just before or just after, we'll still be talking about what the like topic of the episode and find either option is always very interesting, but what we often find we either have completely different opinions on something or completely in line opinions with very little like middle ground. So it's always kind of amusing when
Yeah,
we like start something and I'm like, yeah, so I was thinking that and John is just thinking, yeah. Uh,
me too, man.
or alternatively, one of us will say something and the other guy go like, what? No. Yeah, it's yeah.
Huh? Oh, I
It's not
was
uncommon for us
that's
to stop
wow.
recording and then like keep talking about the subject and realize we had like so much more we could have said about it. But on that note, I do think we've said enough on
Yeah.
this topic for the time being.
If
And also, I can hear the rain starting up a little bit again. And I'm like, maybe we'll just call it before we're taking any risks.
well, at least nature gave us a rain check long enough
Oh
to get
god,
the
I haven't
episode
even done
out.
the outro, and we're already doing shitty puns.
The puns are
Okay. Well, on
always
that note,
ready.
if you are listening to this on Spotify or if it's out there yet over on YouTube, I also put these episodes up on my website, radfordwrites.com. I also share various writings there, the transcripts from stories like A Vampire's Treatise on Vampirism that I write for these episodes. The actual written forms of that all go up on the site as well. I also put blog and article posts up there. And of course, link to my books uh, on the site as well. Those are available on Amazon. And yeah, please do.
Read them. I've got Domino up on the shelf right now.
And you know,
It has a
just as
place of honor.
as a little bit of excitement for you, the work on Domino's spin-off, which is almost certainly going to be called Marble at this point, is the drafting process is
Ooh.
wrapping up, and we will soon be moving fully into editing. So that's pretty exciting. But in the meantime, just keep listening to this podcast. You'll get plenty more of my stories, or buy Domino. I promise it's good. Sad, but good. And
A lot of my favorite things are sad, which might say
but
something
speaking
about
of
me,
things
but I
back
don't
in,
know.
you can of course find John appearing in more of these podcast episodes in the future. He is my most frequent co-host after all. Uh, as well as streaming on Twitch as Sephir, Sephear. I am pretty sure at the time of writing this, he's pretty much going to go from this to streaming shortly after, right?
Yep, as soon as my lovely lady in the chair is up and ready to help me with the tech side of things,
That's going to
we
be in the
going.
past for you, dear audience, but that's okay because he also puts the VODs up on YouTube, also under Sephir.
Yeah. Watch them. They're good. Oh, they're gonna keep getting better. If they're not good
Uh,
now, they will be. I promise.
until then, we'll see you guys next time.